Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Slavery and Freedom in the Shenandoah Valley During the Civil War Era by Jonathan A. Noyalas. Narrated by David Vries. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Foreword. The Shenandoah Valley region has long been a place of wonderment to travelers, settlers, and tourists. It also has been a place of mystery and myth that have hidden more than revealed the complicated and often contradictory social, cultural, and economic history of a place that was in fact many places. For centuries, in travel accounts, in folklore and song, in local histories, and in art and story, travelers and others have described the Shenandoah as a world of farms, ethnic and religious enclaves, and natural beauty that seemed to have little in common with the South of plantations and slavery. Even in 20th century scholarship, that view of the Shenandoah prevails. The influential historian Carl Breidenbaugh, in Myths and Realities, Societies of the Colonial South, 1952, spoke for many historians in his descriptions of the Shenandoah as a pathway for thousands of Scots-Irish, Scots, Rhinelanders, Swiss, and other immigrants peopling the backcountry of the southern colonies, and a patchwork of farms rather than plantations. The variegated population supposedly retained many native tongues and Old World ways, in Breidenbaugh's words, with each little group resisting with all its strength the Americanizing process. Pages 131 to 132, 1971 edition. In such rendering, the Shenandoah was a very diverse place, but also a very white one. One effect of casting the Shenandoah as a region of ethnic and religious diversity and farms, and unlike the Tidewater and other settled areas of the South, where English and plantation culture ruled, was paradoxically to miss or ignore the extent to which that diversity included Africans and then African Americans who made up a significant part of the population in some areas of the region, and lived and worked to some degree in all of it. As the story went for years, the Scots-Irish, German speakers, and other immigrants and migrants who settled in the valley did not want or need African slaves to work their farms. For reasons of culture, conscience, and circumstance, they supposedly kept slavery and blacks out. Such views of the Shenandoah dominated scholarship until recently. As Jonathan Noyalas reveals in his close study of the Shenandoah during the 19th century, blacks throughout the region were significant in numbers, the kinds of work they did, and the culture they created. Rather than anomalies, they were vital to the region's economic and cultural development. Whatever the degree of ethnic and religious diversity in the Shenandoah, race mattered in defining interest and identity, and enslaved Africans and African Americans and free blacks were not passive in the process. In Noyalas's telling, the different kinds and places of work gave enslaved people in the region a nimbleness in being able to understand and adapt to new and varied circumstances. The alertness and awareness that came from working among whites and learning their ways positioned enslaved and free blacks to seize on the unsettlements and upheavals caused by the Civil War that came to the Shenandoah. The region's constant changing of hands as Union and Confederate forces fought to control it created openings for blacks to find freedom in the interstices of white control and to create new ways to assert their freedom. Whether in running to Union lines or joining the Union Army and an ostensible, if still conditional, freedom, or staying in their home places, blacks, in Noyalas's careful accounting, knew their interests and acted accordingly. They also proved savvy in navigating the adjustments that came with the end of the war and efforts at Reconstruction. Their skill in negotiating to further their interests proved essential in carving out their place and building their own institutions, in defining freedom for themselves. White opposition was persistent, and white allies were not always supportive, but blacks did not give up on freedom. In tracking the experiences of blacks in the Shenandoah during the Civil War era, Noyalas expands the scholarship on African American identity and interest by showing how place and circumstance counted in determining the scope and scale of dissent, resistance, and accommodation. He also points to the need to redraw the profile of the slave and then the freedman, to work in the experiences of and consequences for many blacks who lived and worked among whites and learned their ways rather than on plantations that largely separated black from white and included a black community-building culture in the slave quarters. In the end, Noyalas insists there was no single South or single black experience during slavery, sectional conflict, and its aftermath. Freedom was always contingent and contested, and conditioned by circumstance. What this book shows is that for blacks to be free, they needed to know their world and themselves and thereby be ready to seize freedom for themselves whenever and wherever it came. For all this and more, Slavery and Freedom in the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War era is a welcome addition to the Southern Descent series. Stanley Harold and Randall M. Miller, series editors. Introduction. On a cold, rainy day in February 2018, I had the great fortune to lead a team of my students from Shenandoah University on an important mission in Middletown, Virginia, marking potential burial sites of enslaved people and mapping the Mount Zion African American Cemetery. For decades, this cemetery, which contains the graves of enslaved individuals from the Civil War era, had been taken over by Mother Nature and largely forgotten until an effort by the Middletown Heritage Society, led by Ellen Gant, who has family members buried in the cemetery, and Joan Roach, started a movement to clean up Mount Zion. As I worked with students uncovering simple stones that denoted the graves of enslaved people, unfortunately unknown, it struck me that this cemetery's condition and location, situated in a wooded area in the middle of a farm hidden from plain sight, served as a metaphor for the story of African Americans during the Civil War era in the Shenandoah Valley. Furthermore, the experience in Mount Zion underscored the value of examining the past through a more intimate lens. While the majority of grave markers in that cemetery were simple stones with no markings, efforts in that burial ground uncovered a more traditional tombstone, cracked from its base and over time pressed into the earth. A brush of the hand revealed the name Caroline Jenkins chiseled into the stone along with her death date of August 30, 1907, and the epitaph, "God's finger touched her, and she slept." 83 years old at the time of her death, Caroline had been enslaved for almost the first 4 decades of her life in Middletown. For her final 4 decades, Caroline, along with her husband Abraham, who had also been enslaved, attempted to realize freedom's potential in an environment where its meaning was frequently distorted and elusive. While the broad studies historians have produced that examine the African American experience during the Civil War era are significant, they can sometimes, as historian Edward Ayres noted, blur into generalizations and broad categories, and lose sight of the personal battles of living, breathing human beings in the struggle to overcome oppression. At times, in a sweeping survey, one can lose sight of the manner in which, as Gordon Ray argued, seemingly insignificant players could alter the course of history. The region in which Caroline Jenkins lived, labored, and died, the Shenandoah Valley, lends itself well as an inimitable laboratory to study the African American experience during the Civil War era. Not only does it afford an opportunity for a more intimate interaction with individuals long forgotten, but the Valley's wartime experience is arguably without parallel. Not only was the conflict omnipresent in the Shenandoah due to its importance as a source of provender for the Army of Northern Virginia, but also because of its strategic significance to Union and Confederate forces. For Confederates, the Shenandoah Valley served the role of diversionary theater of war and avenue of invasion. For the Union, the Valley served as a place from which to guard Washington, D.C. and block invasion. By the summer of 1864, Union war planners recognized the necessity of seizing the Shenandoah Valley as an important step in crushing the Army of Northern Virginia. Caught in the midst of invading armies, tramping soldiers, occupations, destruction, and incessant fighting were the Shenandoah Valley's enslaved and free blacks. Studying the African American experience in the Shenandoah Valley brings greater clarity to how enslaved and free blacks during our nation's most tumultuous moment navigated life in an incessantly unsettled world where one day they could be in Union territory, the next Confederate, and the following in no man's land. The lives of African Americans in the Shenandoah Valley sharply highlights the fact that emancipation was a contingent, individual process. That history also stresses that freedom was, and still is, extremely fragile. Much has been written about the Civil War era in the Shenandoah Valley, that nearly 180-mile swath, bounded on the west by the Allegheny Mountains and the Blue Ridge Mountains on the east, stretching from Harper's Ferry in the north to Rockbridge County in the south. But the story of how African Americans reacted to, were impacted by, and influenced events leading up to the conflict, during the Civil War and in its immediate aftermath, has largely been hidden. The African American story has remained concealed partially because it has been ignored, but also because various authors since the war's end have obfuscated historical reality for the Shenandoah's African Americans during our nation's defining moment. Among those culpable for suppressing the historical reality of life for African Americans during the Civil War era was Joseph Waddell, publisher of the Stanton Spectator, who enslaved 3 people at the Civil War's outset. 2 decades after the war's end, Waddell published Annals of Augusta County, a book that proved a cornerstone of early scholarship on the Valley. Waddell informed readers that the institution of slavery never had a strong hold in Augusta County due to the fact that the Valley had largely been settled by people of Scots-Irish and German ancestry. The Scotch-Irish race had no love for it, slavery, and German people were generally averse to it. Most farmers cultivate their own lands with the assistance of their sons, Waddell explained. 21 years after publication of Waddell's Annals, John Walter Wayland made similar arguments in his The German Element of the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. As a rule, the Germans of the Shenandoah Valley were opposed to slavery, Wayland concluded. Without any critical analysis of her own, author Julia Davis accepted Waddell's and Wayland's conclusions as she repeated the claim in her 1945 book, The Shenandoah. Davis penned, "The thrifty Germans found it, slavery, wasteful. The Scotch-Irish used but few." In the early 1980s, W. Fitzhugh Brundage, then a Ph.D. candidate at Harvard University, spent his time as the Mary Moody Northern Fellow at the Stonewall Jackson House in Lexington, Virginia, investigating attitudes toward slavery in antebellum Rockbridge County. Among the issues Brundage investigated was the myth of the Scots-Irish possessing an aversion to slavery. Brundage's careful analysis exposed a world vastly different from the ones described by Waddell, Wayland, and Davis. In Rockbridge, a place that boasted a minimum of 2/3 of its white inhabitants claiming Scots-Irish descent, Brundage discovered a vibrant slave economy, one that began to boom during the American Revolution as a result of the Continental Army's need for hemp. Similarly, Waddell's and Wayland's claims that few enslaved people lived and worked in the Shenandoah Valley echo through much of the literature. Davis mimicked Waddell and Wayland when she wrote that there were comparatively few slaves along the Shenandoah. The Germans had never considered it economical to own Negroes. Slightly more than 2 decades later, Laura Virginia Hale, a local historian from Front Royal, Virginia, compiled a massive chronicle, 4 Valiant Years in the Lower Shenandoah Valley. Her volume, which appears in many bibliographies of books published since its release in 1968, not only claims a lack of importance for slavery in the Valley, but makes broad statements that the relationship between enslaver and enslaved was always genial. Hale wrote, "The Valley was not a large slaveholding section. No 2 races ever lived in such harmony as the white and black people." Robert Tanner's Stonewall in the Valley, published 8 years after Hale's tome, also dismisses slavery's importance in the region and notes that by the time of the Civil War's outbreak, slavery had long been declining throughout the valley, and what few slaves remained were among the best treated of the South. First and foremost, there were hardly a few slaves living in the valley by the time the Civil War began, as Tanner suggests. Enslaved people comprised approximately 25% of the total population of the Shenandoah Valley's 10 counties at the Civil War's outset, including Berkeley and Jefferson, which in 1863 officially became part of West Virginia. As this book's first chapter shows, from the time of the first federal census in 1790 until 1860, the number of enslaved people steadily increased, with slight dips between 1830 and 1840, and 1850 and 1860. These declines, as addressed in chapters 1 and 2, might partially be a response to heightened anxieties in the wake of Nat Turner's revolt in 1831 and John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry 28 years later. Furthermore, the claim that slaves remained among the best treated of the South also proves problematic. Less than a decade after Confederate armies surrendered, the once enslaved John Quincy Adams, who fled Frederick County, Virginia, for Pennsylvania during Union General John W. Geary's brief presence in the valley in 1862, published his Reminiscences, a rare account from one of the Shenandoah's formerly enslaved people. Adams wrote that his enslaver's daughters were very good and kind to me. Adams even believed that had Virginia law not prohibited literacy among enslaved people, that they would have taught me to read if they could have their way. Proponents of the lost cause narrative of the Civil War era might undoubtedly see Adams's statement as evidence of slavery's benevolence. However, a full reading of his narrative reveals that although he believed some members of his enslaver's family treated him well, he still resented his enslavement. Adams, who never reported being beaten or family members being battered, regarded his owner and all those who enslaved human beings as wicked people. Physical abuse has too often been used as the litmus test for measuring slavery's barbarity. Although it is difficult to quantify the extent to which enslavers employed physical abuse as a means of control, significant evidence exists which shows that violence against enslaved people did indeed occur in the valley. One of the points of this book's first chapter, which provides an overview of slavery in the Shenandoah Valley stretching back to colonial times, is to highlight the physical abuse endured by enslaved individuals and establish that the treatment African Americans confronted during the Civil War and its immediate aftermath merely continued a long-established pattern in the area. Furthermore, it is important to keep in mind that abuse comes in many forms. Despite Adams's assessment that members of his enslaver's family treated him well, the experience of seeing his twin brother Aaron and sister Sally sold from us at Winchester on the eve of the Civil War proved torturous, so much so that Adams, at least for a moment in his life, hoped for death as a means to get rid of his sorrow and distress. Like all enslaved people, Adams understood that torment took many forms. Even if an enslaved person did not suffer any physical or psychological torment, a rarity, the mere act of one human being owning another proved unconscionable. As Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote in Uncle Tom's Cabin, the thing itself, slavery, is the essence of all abuse. Making statements, then, as some historians have done previously, that enslaved people in the Shenandoah Valley enjoyed better treatment than elsewhere in the South is simply callous, cold-hearted, and reveals a lack of nuanced understanding of the complex relationship between enslaver and enslaved. Some historians, such as Michael Mahan, have professed that the employment of slaves was largely unnecessary in the Shenandoah Valley by the time of the war's outbreak. This, too, is in error. Historian Kenneth Coons, one of the most distinguished scholars of Shenandoah Valley agricultural history, provides convincing evidence through careful analysis of census and other data that enslaved laborers proved a crucial cog in the Valley's agricultural machine on the eve of the Civil War. Slaves and free blacks formed a significant labor force in the antebellum Valley of Virginia, Coons argued. He continued, "Together, through their labor, free and enslaved African Americans contributed to the rise and continuing development of the Valley of Virginia as a highly productive agricultural region that a few years later would gain renown as the breadbasket of the Confederacy." As discussed in the book's opening chapter, slavery in the Shenandoah Valley might not be comparable to areas such as Virginia's Tidewater or South Carolina's Low Country in terms of the average numbers of people enslaved per household or the amount of acreage cultivated by enslaved people, but slavery proved important to the Shenandoah Valley's life and economy. Simply put, slavery was, as one historian concluded, ingrained in the Valley's economy. On the Civil War's eve, 1 out of every 5 Valley residents was enslaved. Additionally, the number of enslaved individuals in the Valley increased by an unknown quantity at various points throughout the year as whites rented enslaved people to perform various seasonal tasks on farms and in local industries, most notably iron furnaces. The Valley, as historian Stephen Longnecker wrote, was as typical on race and labor as any other Southern region. Conditions for slaves were more similar to the rest of the South than different. While historians such as Coons, Longnecker, Edward Ayres, Jonathan Berkey, Suzanne Simmons, Nancy Sorrells, and myself have made some gains in revealing elements of the complexity of the African American story in the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War era, no single study exists that chronicles the African American experience in the Shenandoah Valley during our nation's most tumultuous moment. To date, the best resources for understanding aspects of the African American experience are Edward Ayres' 2 outstanding volumes, In the Presence of Mine Enemies and The Thin Light of Freedom. As important as both of these studies are, however, they only reveal insights into the African American experience in Augusta County, located in the southern or upper Shenandoah Valley, as part of a broader study about how the Civil War era impacted all individuals living in Augusta and Franklin County, Pennsylvania. Ayres' instant classics do little to shed light on the experiences of African Americans in the northern or lower Shenandoah Valley, where on January 5, 1863, Union General Robert Milroy began enforcing President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Additionally, the Lower Valley experienced the bulk of significant military operations during the conflict, and thus African Americans who lived there experienced the conflict differently than those in Augusta County, an area less in a state of flux throughout the war. Although part of the same Shenandoah Valley, the experiences of African Americans in the Northern Valley compared to its southern reaches made it seem as if they were a world away. While this history builds on earlier works such as Ayres' studies and other scholars mentioned previously, I have made extensive use of untapped primary material in constructing this volume. Anyone who researches African American history understands the difficulties inherent in the task. In his outstanding study, The Calculus of Violence, historian Aaron Sheehan-Dean notes that historians who explore African American history are customarily relegated to using the passing observations of soldiers and civilians to reconstruct the lives of enslaved individuals and free blacks. While this study indeed utilizes letters and diaries of white soldiers and white civilians, Union and Confederate, it also employs previously untapped evidence that offers a compelling look into the lives of the Valley's African Americans. Underutilized or never-before-used primary material such as interviews Union soldiers conducted with enslaved people who fled enslavers in late 1861 and early 1862, housed in General Nathaniel P. Banks's papers at the Library of Congress, thousands of documents from the Freedmen's Bureau's operations in the lower Shenandoah Valley, and service records of United States colored troops who hailed from the Shenandoah Valley inform this study. Although extremely rare, freedom narratives from two people once enslaved in the Shenandoah Valley, Bethany Veeney and John Quincy Adams, lend an African-American voice. Valley historians have used Veeney's The Narrative of Bethany Veeney, a Slave Woman, published in 1890, to better understand the African-American experience in the Valley. While powerful, her narrative covers the experiences of African Americans prior to the conflict. Adams's narrative of the life of John Quincy Adams, when in slavery and now as a free man, published in 1872, presents a first-hand account of his experience and that of his family during the conflict in Frederick County. Despite the richness of Adams's narrative, it has been neglected by scholars. Use of these materials, along with newspapers and analysis of census data, comprise the corpus of evidence utilized to chronicle the African American experience in the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War era. This study aims to examine the various ways enslaved people in the years leading up to and during 4 years of war resisted their enslavement. Sometimes that resistance took rather overt forms, from arson in the wake of John Brown's raid, a moment that various historians contend elicited little response from the Valley's enslaved population, to planning insurrection against Confederate forces that occupied Winchester in the war's opening months, or fleeing bondage. At other times, this book reveals that some enslaved people chose more passive options during the era, such as gambling or killing an enslaver's livestock. Additionally, this work illuminates the uncertain nature of freedom and how the region's African Americans navigated that ambiguity in a region that experienced numerous battles, occupations, skirmishes, and raids, 326 by one accounting. This study illustrates that uncertainties about freedom appeared not only during Confederate occupations, but Union ones as well, particularly General Robert Patterson's presence in the Valley in the spring and summer of 1861. Collaterally, this study offers insight into not only how enslaved people viewed Union troops, but traces the evolution of Union policy toward African Americans in a region war planners in Washington, D.C. deemed important to the capital's safety as well as the broader Union war effort. As this book contends, however, while the region's African Americans certainly viewed Union troops and the federal government as great allies in their quest for freedom during the conflict and its immediate wake, they were not passive in their pursuit of emancipation. Quite the contrary. Whether fleeing bondage to enlist in United States colored troop regiments, serving as spies for Union officers in the Valley, working as laborers, teaching in freedmen's schools after the war, raising money to support those schools, or organizing Emancipation Day celebrations, the region's African Americans were active participants in their quest for liberty. For all of their efforts and any progress they might have made in resisting injustice and inequality, the Valley's African Americans confronted numerous obstacles during the Civil War era. Whether free blacks, as evidenced in Chapter 4, were captured by Confederates and enslaved, or contended with angry former Confederates who tried to erect impediments to education in the conflict's aftermath, as examined in Chapter 7, the challenges the Shenandoah Valley's African Americans confronted seemed at times insurmountable. However, patience, persistence, and a firm belief that they stood on the right side of history kept hope alive. From this book rise new heroes, individuals long forgotten and now resurrected: Robert Orrick, Thomas Laws, Edward Hall, and Caroline Jenkins, to name a few. This study reveals stories of determination among people who suffered unquantifiable horrors and injustice. Finally, from this book comes confirmation, as one former Shenandoah Valley slave observed after the conflict, that nothing is more glorious to know than that an individual is free. 1. In the Land of Bondage. In 1727, at a time when the first white settlers began trickling into the Shenandoah Valley to establish permanent settlements, the first enslaved people came to the valley, not to labor for an enslaver, but seeking freedom. This group of 15 enslaved people fled their master east of the Blue Ridge Mountains and settled near Lexington, Virginia. For a time they enjoyed freedom, built homes, and farmed the land. Unfortunately, they were discovered and returned to slavery. However, as slavery increased in numbers and importance in the ensuing decades,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?